The most famous photograph in Jewish history is David Rubinger's snapshot of three soldiers side by side in 1967 at the Western Wall, seemingly staring up at the newly captured Temple Mount, or Har Habayit. As the writer Yossi Klein Halevi describes, the soldier in the middle of the photograph, Yitzchak Yifat, is one of the most recognizable faces in Israel and the Jewish world. Once, Yossi writes, in Rockefeller Center in New York, a woman with numbers on her arm stopped him and said, "Aren't you the boy from the Wailing Wall?" On the 40th anniversary of the photo, Yossi Klein Halevi went out to seek Yifat and sat with him, interviewed him in a cafe in Tel Aviv. Now, I should note that, like most of us, Yifat has over the decades gotten heavier and balder. Nevertheless, 40 years after the fact, Yossi writes how a big man with a shaved head and leather jacket passed us, abruptly stopped, pointed, and said, "Hakotel? The wall?" Yifat nodded without enthusiasm. "I'm the chief police detective for the Tel Aviv area," the man explained. "Lots of people know me, but when I leave this world, no one will remember me. No one will remember that I was ever alive. But you," the police chief said to Yifat, "you will be remembered forever." So Yifat said, "I'm going to just die like anyone else." And the police officer said, "Don't make fun," writes Yossi, mistaking Yifat's modesty for contempt. "You should appreciate the gift. I'd give anything to be in that picture." And so the image's allure crosses all demographics: Sephardic, Ashkenazic, religious, secular. But here, ladies and gentlemen, is what's so fascinating. Decades after the photograph was taken, David Rubinger, the photographer, was asked if he believes it to be the best photograph that he ever took. "The worst," he replied. "From a photographic perspective, it's a bad picture. A good photograph includes no unnecessary elements, but here there are all kinds of people in the background, half a head here, a quarter of a nose there. It's an important photograph," he said, "but not a good one." In his memoir, Rubinger reports that precisely because he did not think the photo was so special, he gave it away. Rubinger writes that, quote, "In a moment of generosity, I gave it to the army spokesman, giving little thought to the implications of my actions. What happened next," he continues, "was that he wasted no time meaning the army office, wasted no time in handing the negative over to the government press office, which in turn made prints and started distributing them for $1 a piece." And so, why are we so entranced by these three soldiers staring up at the Temple Mount? What's so special about that sight? And what does it tell us about the meaning of Jerusalem and Jewish history? We address these questions by studying the several centuries of our people's story described in the Book of Kings, because this book in Scripture starts with the temple's creation and ends with its destruction several centuries later. We will cover from Solomon to Hezekiah, approximately 3 centuries, from around the 11th till the end of the 8th century and into the 7th century BCE. Looming over the tale that we will tell is the question of what the temple actually embodies, and how that sacred site always reminds us of the miracle that is the Jewish story. When we last left the dying David, he had designated his son Solomon as his heir and handed over all of his plans for the temple that was yet to be. On his deathbed, David warned Solomon, then a teenager, to remove all threats to his rule, but to always obey the law of Moses. "And keep the charge of the Lord thy God," he says, "to walk in his ways, as is written in the law of Moses, that thou mayest prosper in all that thou doest." Following David's death, God appears to Solomon and offers to grant his deepest desire. Solomon's request of God is justly celebrated. He says, "Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people?" Meaning, what Solomon seeks is wisdom, which we must emphasize is different than mere intelligence. Saul Bellow famously describes how, as a young man in university, he and his friends would gather at the home of his immigrant aunt in Chicago, and they would excitedly discuss the theories of Trotskyism and Leninism. After his friends left, his aunt would say to him, "Saul, your friends, they are smart, so smart, but stupid. Smarts is not wisdom. Those are two very different things. And it is not smarts that Solomon seeks, but spiritual insight. And as we shall see, this wisdom will provide him with an incredible vision, but his attempt to achieve this vision will ultimately prove his undoing. God grants the king not only wisdom, but wealth and power. Solomon used what he has been bestowed to fulfill his father's dream and erect the temple atop Jerusalem. The text describes its splendor. It featured not only the original cultic articles that adorned the tabernacle, but many duplicates and golden images and decorations that lent a splendor the likes of which were unknown to Israel. But Solomon stresses that the glory, the physical glory, is only an external manifestation of the temple's true spiritual greatness. And as he gathers all Israel, Solomon delivers one of the greatest speeches in the Bible, explaining to us the theology of Jerusalem and the temple for all eternity. What he has created, Solomon says, is first and foremost a central place of worship. From this location, all sacrifices would be offered, and there the people would gather on festivals. And even as they scattered around Israel for the rest of the year, or even if they were at war or captured by the enemy and taken captive in a foreign land, it is toward Jerusalem that Jews will forever pray. He says to God, "And hearken thou to the supplication of thy servant and thy people Israel when they shall pray toward this place. And hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and when thou hearest, forgive." All this, of course, is meant to unify Israel. And it is the heart of David's original dream. But then, ladies and gentlemen, Solomon adds something on his own. This comes from his vision, his wisdom. In his prayer to God at Jerusalem before all Israel, Solomon adds something radically new, and he says, "Moreover, concerning a stranger that is not of thy people Israel, but cometh out of a far country for thy name's sake, for they shall hear of thy great name and of thy strong hand and of thy stretched out arm. When he," meaning the Gentiles, "shall come and pray toward this house, hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and do according to all that the stranger calleth to thee for, that all people of the earth may know thy name, and that they may know that this house which I have built is called by thy name." So for David, Jerusalem is meant to be a source of Israel's unity. Solomon embraces that, but he further suggests that Jerusalem can draw Gentiles from all over the world to Israel, and thereby to Israel's God. What will attract them to this temple is a miracle, a mystery, one which Solomon openly admits that, as wise as he is, he himself cannot solve. How an infinite Almighty can take a permanent residence on a mountaintop in Jerusalem. Solomon says, "Will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and heaven of heavens cannot contain thee." Meaning, the God of the universe who dwells in a tiny temple. This, and I'm drawing on an insight of Hillel Halkin, this represents the miracle of the Jewish people, in which the God of all history makes himself known through a small people amongst all those on earth. It is in Jerusalem that the world will come to know the miracle that is the temple, where an infinite God makes himself manifest in a small space, and they will thereby come to know the small people through whom God makes himself manifest. This is Solomon's remarkable vision. Not of all peoples becoming Jews, but of all peoples coming to know the Jewish God. It is a wise and a great vision, but how to achieve it? The answer for Solomon is empire. Thus we are told that, quote, "Solomon reigned over all the kingdoms from the river unto the land of the Philistines and unto the border of Egypt. They brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life." This is the only time in Jewish history that Israel oversees an empire. And the goal is to draw everyone to monotheism. As Rabbi Alex Israel suggests, Solomon seeks, quote, "to create a national enterprise that is so impressive, that is so imbued with God and so reflects his presence, that people will be amazed and inspired by Jerusalem. He seeks to galvanize worldwide homage to God." And we find at first hints of success. The queen of faraway Sheba comes to praise the God of Abraham, but maintaining an empire for Solomon leads to the following: heavy taxation for the king's accumulation of funds, maintenance of enormous amounts of cavalry, horsemen, and most disastrously, the establishment of political alliances through Solomon's marriage to many foreign women, first and foremost the daughter of Pharaoh. All of these actions are explicitly forbidden in Deuteronomy's Laws of Kings, which seeks to ensure monarchical humility and protection of the monarchy from pagan culture. A Jewish state must have the power to defend itself, but it will impact the larger world not through an empire of power, but through an empire of ideas. A Jewish political empire, in contrast, allows Israel to be impacted by the pagans from whom it must remain apart. If, as Voltaire cynically once remarked, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, Solomon seeks a holy Israelite empire, but in creating a political empire, what he has made is not holy. Solomon's vision of the world coming to know the God of Jerusalem's temple was brilliant, far-reaching. It animates Judaism today. It was wise, but his mistake was how he sought to reach this goal. In Spielberg's movie Lincoln, the president notes that having a vision is not enough. He said as follows, "A compass I learned," Lincoln said, this is in the movie, "a compass I learned when I was surveying, it'll point you true north from where you're standing, but it's got no advice about the swamps and deserts and chasms that you'll encounter along the way. If," Lincoln said in the film, "if in pursuit of your destination, you plunge ahead heedless of obstacles and achieve nothing more than to sink in a swamp, what's the use of knowing true north?" Solomon had a true north, a glorious vision, but the map to avoid the obstacles along the way is the Torah, which was mentioned by David on his deathbed, but in the end, Solomon is held responsible for facilitating, for allowing, and perhaps facilitating the pagan worship of his many wives, so that what had begun as a dream of an empire, which would turn the world toward the temple in Jerusalem in worship of the true God, instead concludes with pagan temples surrounding the very same sacred city. It is with an understanding of Solomon's vision of pagan altars surrounding the very same sacred city. It is with an understanding of Solomon's vision that the painful punishment which follows is so fitting. Solomon sought to rule over the entire Middle East, and in the end, God declares that his dynasty will not even rule over most of Israel. One of Solomon's tax collectors from the tribe of Joseph, Jeroboam, is prophetically informed that he will now found and father a new dynasty leading 10 out of the 12 tribes, all except Judah and Benjamin. Upon Solomon's death and the succession of Solomon's son Rehoboam, Jeroboam launches a populist revolt against the labor and taxation of the Solomonic Empire, and the empire instantly disintegrates. Jeroboam is crowned ruler of the northern kingdom, posed to become a great leader, but he now is ultimately undone by envy. Even as northern Israel has a new king, it is still obligated to celebrate festivals in Jerusalem. Israel's relationship with God is greater than politics itself, and the honor given to the Davidic capital in worship is intolerable to Jeroboam. Jeroboam therefore creates two temples of his own, one at Tel Dan, which can still be seen today in the Galilee, and one at Beit El. Though both were adorned with golden calves, it's not clear that they were actually worshipped, and even if they were, what's being created in syncretistic fashion is service, illegitimate service, but service nonetheless, of the God of Israel. This is very possibly not entirely pagan. But the central sin at this point was not perhaps paganism as much as luring Jews away from the uniting spiritual force that was Jerusalem. From Jerusalem and from the temple that makes manifest the miracles of Israel. Paganism is a terrible sin. Syncretism is a sin. But the greatest sin of all is removing Israel from Jerusalem. The Talmud captures Jeroboam's failure in a profound tale which sounds a little bit like a Jewish joke, wherein Jeroboam is informed by the Almighty that if he, Jeroboam, rules righteously, he will walk in paradise with God and with David. And Jeroboam responds, "Fine, but who goes first?" All Jeroboam had to do was recognize the spiritual supremacy of Jerusalem, and then 10 tribes would have been ruled by his family for generations. Instead, he wickedly and successfully seeks to pull most of Israel away from the spiritual lure of the temple itself. If there is a motto summarizing his sin, it is, "I will forget thee, O Jerusalem." And his tale forever warns against Jews loosening their own spiritual link to that sacred site. Some years ago, there was a prominent media couple from Washington that published a Haggadah, where they revealed their own version of the Haggadah, where they revealed that their own family Passover Seder in suburban Washington ends with the words, "Next year in Bethesda." This couple's predecessor lived thousands of years ago, and his name is Jeroboam, who, as he now stands atop the altar that he has built away from Jerusalem, he is visited by a man of God, a prophet who foretells a time centuries in the future when all that Jeroboam built will be undone. And even sooner, the prophet says, will be the undoing of Jeroboam's dynasty. From this point forward, the book known as Kings will actually describe two very different regimes with two very different destinies. We have to the north Malchut Yisrael, the kingdom of Israel, marked by anarchy and sin, regicide, and any number of dynasties. And then the south, the kingdom of Yehudah, Judah, which will have both evil and righteous rulers, but with one terrible exception, all will be from the house of David. We begin in the north. Jeroboam rules for 40 years, and upon his death, his son, Elah, reigns until he is murdered, bringing about the reign of a new king by the name of Baasha. He is succeeded by his son in turn. During this time period, war exists between Israel's kings and those of Judah. Rehavam's son Aviah and his son Asa. The son of Baasha, king of the north, is eliminated by a servant in what becomes a murder-suicide. So already, the northern kingdom has gone through 4 generations, 2 different dynasties, Jeroboam and Baasha. Into the breach steps Omri, a king politically gifted but disastrously unmoored from the biblical vision. Omri moves the capital of the northern kingdom to the city of Samaria, and under him the northern kingdom establishes alliance and expands its power. Omri is politically gifted but spiritually inclined to paganism. Thus, he establishes a bond between his government and that of the Phoenicians by marrying off his son and heir, Ahab, Achav, to a now infamous Phoenician princess, Jezebel, or Izebel, who was herself a single-minded apostle for the pagan divinity Baal, the Middle Eastern god of rain, fertility, storms, and agriculture. Under Ahab, Baal effectively becomes the national god of the northern kingdom of Israel. Jezebel emerges as the biblical Lady Macbeth, who brings out the worst instincts in her husband Ahab. Under her influence, all prophets of the one true God are murdered except for one, Elijah. This famous but mysterious man challenges the purported power of Baal to grant rain by declaring a terrible drought. He then challenges Jezebel's prophets and proves that only the one true God and not Baal brings forth lightning and fire from heaven. As Elijah performs these miracles, Israel embraces God for a moment, but then lapses back into paganism. Elijah abandons hope, flees to the desert to Mount Sinai, and complains to God of Israel's wickedness. There God appears to Elijah in what is called in Hebrew a kol demama daka, whose English translation gives us a phrase which would be made famous millennia later by 2 Jews in the borough of Queens. God appears to Elijah in the sound of silence. The point appears to be that Elijah's massive miracles are ineffective, and that he is now ordered to appoint another prophet, Elisha, whose pastoral gifts were more suited to the moment, whose many miracles would speak to the crises of people's personal lives, who would, as it were, find God in the silent moments, not in the massive miraculous, not in the massive displays of divine might. As Elijah concludes his career, despairing of the northern kingdom, Judah to the south is ruled by Jehoshaphat, who oversaw a spiritually blessed time. But Jehoshaphat, in his righteousness, also felt a great Jewish love for his brethren, the Israelites to the north. And, as with Solomon, his great vision of unity between brethren will be sought with means that are not appropriate. In an attempt to bind brethren, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, marries his son and heir Achaziah to Ahab's evil daughter Athaliah. Under her influence, Achaziah, king of Judah, when he succeeds his father Jehoshaphat, will become more Ahabite in perspective than Davidic. more pagan than monotheistic. And he will therefore be included, even though he's the king of Judah, in the divine punishment to be meted out on the household of Achav, the punishment that is yet to come. Ahab dies in battle, the dogs licking his blood. He is succeeded by his son Jehoram, king of northern Israel. And God now decrees that the time has come for the eradication of Ahab's dynasty. The prophet Elisha therefore sends a colleague, a fellow prophet, to a general of Ahab, Jehu. The prophet takes Jehu aside, anoints him in the name of God, and secretly informs him that he will become king and that his obligation is to ensure that no remnant of Ahab's household endures. In a sublimely strange but somewhat amusing scene, after the prophet leaves, Jehu's fellow generals cynically inquire of him a phrase that gives us one of our most important Jewish words. Madua ba ha-mishuga hazeh elecha. Why did this mishuganer, this crazy person, meaning the prophet, come to you? Jehu responds, the prophet is here to tell me that I'm the new king. And the scoffers suddenly and opportunistically turn on a dime and instantly announce, long live the king! Jehu travels to the city of Jezreel, where King Jehoram of northern Israel is recovering from a battle wound, along with Achaziah, his brother-in-law, king of Judah. Jehu arranges for both kings to come out and meet him, whereupon he slays them both. He then journeys to the palace in Jezreel, where Jezebel, Ahab's widow, is watching from atop the palace. Jehu from the ground orders Jezebel's guards to push her out the window, and they gladly do so. Jehu then sends a letter to the capital arranging for the killing of all of Ahab's sons, 42 in all. Their heads are sent to Jehu in Jezreel in baskets. Jehu then journeys as king to Samaria and pretends to proclaim a holiday celebrating the god Baal. He gathers the pagan prophets within a temple, massacres them all, burns the temple to the ground, and turns it into a latrine. This was the Almighty's vengeance against the pagan devotion of the house of Ahab. This was Jehu, the newly minted king, representative of divine wrath. Thus, with Elisha replacing Elijah, and with the family of Ahab entirely eliminated, the stage is set for a spiritual reset. All could have been overcome had Jehu at this moment turned, like the soldiers in Rubinger's photo, toward Jerusalem in yearning and hope. Not to unite all the tribes politically, but spiritually. But Jehu, like Jeroboam, refuses to help his subjects return spiritually to Jerusalem. As punishment, Hazael, king of Aram, is providentially sent by God to wreak havoc on the northern kingdom of Israel. At this point, Jehu turns in alliance to an emerging world power, Assyria. He journeys to the king of Assyria and pays tribute, thereby allowing Israel to become a vassal state of the growing empire of Assyria and its ruler at the time, Shalmaneser. This event we know not from the Bible, but from something else which is incredible. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser, which sits in the British Museum, dating to 827 BCE. It is a large stone containing Assyrian records. But here is what is incredible. The obelisk not only describes King Jehu bringing a tribute to the Assyrian king Shalmaneser, the obelisk actually gives us an image of the Israelite king in doing so, which means, ladies and gentlemen, that Jehu, king of the northern kingdom of Israel, is the only member of our people mentioned by name in the Bible of which a picture actually exists. This alone is worth the trip to London and the visit to the British Museum. Everybody runs to go see the Rosetta Stone and leaves out the Assyrian wing, where the most incredible objects of all are to be found. Ironically, on this obelisk, our only known picture of a biblical king is his abject humiliation. We see King Jehu of Israel bowing down before Shalmaneser of Assyria. A man, Jehu, who came to power through so much brutal force, now crouches powerless. The one picture we have of a Jewish biblical character is thus a fitting testament to Jehu's biblical legacy. The stage had been set for a religious renaissance, for the embrace of biblical monotheism under Jehu's political leadership and Elisha's spiritual guidance. But alas, while the prophets of Baal had been destroyed, The embrace of idolatry continued. Because of this failure, Jehu is informed that his own dynasty will only last 4 generations after him. Of all the kings of the northern kingdom, Jehu was the best, but he was not nearly good enough. To go to London, to see Jehu on this obelisk, to see the rise of Assyria and the subjection and defeat of the kings of Israel before it, is to see in this very obelisk the beginning of the end of the northern kingdom. Meanwhile, what occurs in the southern kingdom has the potential to be even more horrible. Remember that Jehu not only killed Ahab's son, he also killed Ahab's son-in-law, Ahaziah, king of Judah, who had been married in a shidduch of unity to Ahab's daughter. Ahaziah's widow, Athaliah of the house of Achav, living in Jerusalem, when she sees that her husband has been killed, stages her own coup in Judah, killing all descendants of the house of David, including, it seems, all of her own grandchildren, and seizes power. In one moment, the Davidic dynasty was wiped out, or so it would seem. Into the breach steps one of the great forgotten heroes of Jewish history. Her name is Yehosheva, wife of the high priest, herself a member of the royal family, which allows her access to Queen Athaliah's palace. And as all the princes were being murdered, she stole one child out of the complex and hid him in the temple itself, the last potential Davidic king. If we pause, ladies and gentlemen, for one moment, we realize how far Jerusalem has strayed from Solomon's original vision. As the book of Kings began, we saw Solomon with the temple built. He was revered by his people in the entire Middle East, and now, several centuries later, his kingdom is divided. His own tribe of Judah is ruled by a pagan queen from another Israelite family. And in the temple that Solomon had thought would display the glory of David's vision to the world, now the last living descendant of David hides from all the world. But it's also so poignant, because we will see that from the inside of the temple, from the Temple Mount, the resurrection of the house of David and of Judea shall go forth to the people. After several years and one of the most dramatic moments in the Bible, this child heir of David, Joash, the one true king, is brought forth by the high priest. Hearing the acclamation of the people, Queen Athaliah exits her palace and sees the grandchild that she had tried to murder, and who is actually very much alive, and who is about to kill her. This is probably the most uncomfortable family reunion in the history of the human race. British history tells us that George IV hated his wife, Queen Caroline, intensely. So much so that after Napoleon's passing, the king's ministers said to George, "Your Majesty, your greatest enemy is dead." And King George replied, "Is she really?" But he was joking, kind of. But here, the grandmother is truly the great enemy of her grandson. Seeing him, Queen Athaliah shrieks, "Kesher, Kesher, treason, treason." And then the usurper queen is killed, allowing for the eradication of the influence of Ahab's house in Israel. The new king of David of Judah, Joash, rules righteously as long as his guide, the high priest, lives, after which Israel slides again away from righteous monotheism. But the descendants that follow Joash in Judah for several generations, Amaziah, Uzziah, Yotam, are largely praised for removing idolatry from Judea. And yet the Bible stresses even then that in the southern kingdom of Judah, offerings were brought outside the temple to God, but outside Jerusalem, which meant that even in Judea, spiritual unity around Jerusalem did not exist. Meanwhile, in the northern kingdom, Elisha circles the country, prophesying for decades. But King Jehu's heirs embrace idolatry. And it is ultimately his dynasty is ultimately overthrown, civil war ensues, and Pekach ben Ramalyahu ultimately becomes king. Assyria at this point has become the sole superpower in the region. It is led by Tiglath-Pileser, who comes to the throne in the 740s BCE. Pekach, king of Israel, joins Damascus in an attempted revolt. These rulers ask the southern kingdom of Judah to join them, but its king, Jehoahaz, refuses and instead becomes a vassal of Assyria. Jehoahaz, king of Judah, following several generations of righteous kings, now abandons the righteousness of his ancestors and further imports Assyrian idolatry into Jerusalem and into the temple as a symbol of his submission to Assyria. The northern kingdom of Israel fights Assyria without the southern Judeans, and Assyria's response is swift and harsh. It conquers much of Israel and begins deporting its residents into exile. If you visit the British Museum, you will see an actual stone image from the palace of the Assyrian emperor Tiglath-Pileser of the Israelites going into exile. It is absolutely heartbreaking. What started with this king Tiglath-Pileser continued with his two Assyrian successors, Shalmaneser V and then Sargon II, exiling Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, completely under the reign of the final king of the northern kingdom. Thus the Bible says, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria, and placed them in Chala and Chabor by the river of Gozan. For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, which had brought them out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods. Under Sargon, the awful evil genius of Assyrian empire was first applied. When a country was conquered by Assyria, its inhabitants were taken to another land and forcibly assimilated. The 10 tribes are thus lost, denuded of any Israelite identity. So devastating a moment is this in Jewish memory, the loss of 10 out of the 12 tribes, that legends begin to grow about a secret location where they lie hiding, forever protected by the Sabbath-observant river known as Sambatyon, which will ravage and rage 6 days a week. Throughout Jewish history, Jewish statesmen, philosophers, and writers would seek, largely, if not entirely in vain, to identify these long-lost Israelites. The northern kingdom of Israel is gone. Only Judah to the south remains. As we mentioned, Jehoahaz, king of Judah, submitted to Assyrian rule, allowed idolatry into the temple itself. But his son was one of the greatest biblical kings to ever live, Hezekiah, or Chizkiyahu. We saw that under Yehu to the north, the hoped-for religious renaissance in the northern kingdom never took place, but under Hezekiah in the southern kingdom of Judah, faith flourishes. Not only was idolatry abolished, but with Hezekiah, service of God was restored solely to the temple in Jerusalem as Solomon intended. The resurgence of faith was followed by a resurgence of nationalism. Hezekiah rebelled against Assyria. Assyria in turn enters Judea and destroys city after city. In one of those sites, a fortified town known as Lachish, Sancherib, king of Assyria, achieved a victory so overwhelming that he chose to memorialize it forever in his palace in Nineveh. These images from this palace are now also found in the British Museum. I discussed them in my video for the series that Tikva has just recently launched, Jews, the Case for God. I urge you to watch that video about Assyria if you have not yet, because the gifted videographers that produce the video show us how to be inside that chamber, to look at the images that are now in the British Museum, depicting the destruction of the Judean town of Lachish by Assyria, is to physically feel as if you've stepped into the domicile of the Assyrian Empire. You see astonishing image after image. On one panel, Jewish prisoners are flayed. In another, women are led into exile. In another, men sadly strum harps as they are forced into slavery by the Assyrians. With Lachish destroyed, King Sancherib of Assyria sets his sight on Jerusalem, and its inhabitants must have felt that they were doomed. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, the very future of Judaism hung in the balance more than any other time in Jewish history. If Jerusalem falls, Sancherib would deport the Jews of Jerusalem to faraway lands, assimilate them just as the 10 lost tribes had disappeared. There would no longer be Jews. Hezekiah prepares for a siege. Jerusalem's water source from its very beginnings was the Gihon spring outside the walls of the city. So Hezekiah created a tunnel between Jerusalem and the Gihon, diverting its waters, creating a pool within Jerusalem, what is now known as the Pool of Siloam. In the 19th century, a child playing in that tunnel found a plaque left by Hezekiah's original engineers, celebrating what they had done, revealing amazingly that they had started from two different sides, inside and outside the city, dug and somehow found each other and met in the middle. The ancient engineering ingenuity is astonishing, and yet the actual conquest of Jerusalem still seems imminent. Sancheriv's second in command, Rav Shakeh, comes to the city walls and he tells the Jews to surrender, to be assimilated rather than killed. And this is what Rav Shakeh says. And he stands next to the Hezekiah fortifications of Jerusalem, known today as the Broad Wall, which can still be seen in the Old City today. General of Assyria, Rav Shakeh says, "Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Hearken not unto Hezekiah when he persuades you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Who are they among all the gods of the countries that have delivered their country out of mine hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of mine hand?" Meaning, Rav Shakeh is saying, where are the gods of all the other Assyrian conquests? Why do you think your God will save you? At this point, Hezekiah ascends the Temple Mount, prays before God, and says, O Lord God of Israel, which dwellest between the cherubim, thou art God, thou alone. I beseech thee, save thou out of his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that thou art the Lord God, even thou only. Upon issuing this plea, God answers Hezekiah through the prophet Isaiah, who comes and tells him that redemption is assured. And so it was. As Assyria camps around Jerusalem, the Bible tells us, it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And the tale succinctly concludes with one of the more unintentionally amusing and ambiguous phrases in Scripture. Vayashkimu baboker v'hinei kulam pekarim metim. And it was when they woke up in the morning that they were dead. We've all been there, ladies and gentlemen. 185,000 Assyrians surrounding Jerusalem, all struck dead in one moment. It is the greatest salvation since the Exodus, most miraculous salvific experience by Israel in the land of Israel. As I mentioned in the Case for God video, historians also have Assyrian records where Sancheriv crows that he has trapped Hezekiah as a bird is trapped in its cage. All scholars agree that Assyria was on the verge of destroying Jerusalem, and then suddenly, mysteriously, he didn't. And soon after, this terrifying empire that almost ended Judaism forever ceases to exist. The answer offered by the Bible is that Israel was saved by God. To this day, the ancient tunnel plaque celebrating Israel's engineering genius sits in the Archaeology Museum in Istanbul. Israel rightly yearns to have Hezekiah's plaque returned. There was an amusing story in the paper which described how when a Turkish zoo needed an elephant, an Israeli government minister proposed a trade, pachyderm for plaque. But no such luck. Hezekiah's tunnel is one of the most ancient embodiments of Jewish Jerusalem's genius. Turkey refuses to return it, even as it complains that many of its own treasures are in other museums around the world. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, as impressive as Hezekiah's tunnel is, the one passage in Isaiah that seems to address it is remarkably quite critical. The prophet Isaiah says, Ye made also a ditch between the two walls for the water of the old pool, but ye have not looked unto the maker thereof, neither had respect unto him that fashioned it long ago. Isaiah is saying that, of course, a country must responsibly prepare for war with out-of-the-box thinking, military strategy, engineering genius. But Isaiah seems to sense that at the very least there was not sufficient feeling of needing divine assistance from those who created the tunnel. The tunnel is an act of human brilliance, worthy of our admiration, even awe. But in the end, Hezekiah ascends to the temple to seek salvation, and from there a miracle emerges. And this miracle did not go unnoticed. After Assyria's downfall, Hezekiah is visited by the leaders of Babylon. They seem somehow to be attracted by Israel's mysterious endurance, that they have survived the greatest enemy of all other countries in the Near East. And as they visit, rather than draw them to his God, Hezekiah merely shows them the golden glory of the temple. And Isaiah, in turn, tells Hezekiah that one day Babylonia would return to destroy the temple itself. This we shall discuss next week. Hezekiah was one of the greatest of Jewish kings, but he could have been greater. The sages of the Talmud assert that Hezekiah, following this salvation from Assyria, could have ushered in the Messianic age. And it is at this time indeed that the prophet Isaiah spoke of the nations of the world coming to Jerusalem to study Torah. The painful truth is that precisely when it did not have an empire, when it achieved the stunning, miraculous victory over the greatest assembled army on earth, when Jerusalem mysteriously endured, at that time, the world was ready to hear about the God of Abraham who dwelled in Jerusalem. It was precisely during Hezekiah's reign that Solomon's dream could have come true, not through Israel creating an empire of power, but rather through utilizing the miracle of Jerusalem's survival to draw the world to Jerusalem. Today, to study Hezekiah's tale is to reflect as well on the miraculous endurance of Jews and of Jerusalem. I have taken some of my students from Yeshiva University to the British Museum. And as we stood there looking at the Lachish reliefs, looking at the assault of our enemies who destroyed 10 out of 12 tribes and most of the kingdom of Judah, one of the greatest enemies we have ever known, we are looking there as Jews wearing our kippot, and a non-Jewish tourist, father with his son, walks past us. And the father says to his child, perhaps more loudly than tact would have demanded, he says, "Wow, they're looking at images of Jews, and they're Jews." And the point hit home. There was no other people who could visit an antiquities collection and see images of their ancestors from 2,500 or 3,000 years ago. These symbols of Jewish destruction in London are in a sense more powerful, are in a sense more inspiring to me than many actual experiences in synagogue that I have had. Because whether or not this makes me a terrible rabbi is for you, ladies and gentlemen, my audience, to decide. But for me, it shows us pictures of our people. We experience with them their pain and their suffering, and yet in the very moment, we reflect on our amazing endurance. And as I mentioned in my Case for God videos, only Jews can stand in London and look at the reliefs of an extinct enemy of Jerusalem, and then return to the Jerusalem of Hezekiah, then is now a Jewish city, standing at the very wall, the broad wall that Hezekiah built against Assyria. Hezekiah reminds us that it is not ultimately gold or grandeur or even military or engineering brilliance that can fully explain our story. To visit Jerusalem today, to stand at Hezekiah's wall, is to hear the words of the Assyrian general Rav Sakeh, which he proclaimed at the very same site, but with a very different meaning. Where are the gods of the other nations? Where are the other nations themselves? The mystery of God's indwelling on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is a reminder of the mystery of Israel's endurance and the divine source and signs of that endurance. It's with this perspective, ladies and gentlemen, that we can conclude by understanding why David Rubinger's photo of the three soldiers is so emotionally impactful. The picture is constantly compared to an American image, which is that of the Marines hoisting aloft the Stars and Stripes at Iwo Jima. But in fact, however, the two pictures are opposites. The Iwo Jima image inspires because it is an action that it illustrates, soldiers hoisting the flag. In Rubinger's photo, the emphasis is the exact opposite. What stresses not action, but sudden inaction. After achieving the most famous Jewish military victory in 2,000 years, the soldiers suddenly stand still before the Temple Mount. As Yossi Klein Halevi writes, Rubinger's image endures in part because of the humility it conveys. At their moment of triumph, the conquerors are themselves conquered. The paratroopers, epitome of Zionism's new Jews, stand in gratitude before the Jewish past, suddenly realizing that they owe their existence to its persistence and longing. Rubinger's photograph, writes Halevi, catches a precise historical moment, the return of the last 2,000 years of Jewish history to the Zionist story. Judaism posited a daring idea that God's power and goodness would be revealed not only in the majesty of nature, but in the messiness of history, in Jewish history. The reverence that many Jews felt toward the photograph of the paratrooper was the stunned realization, seemingly reflected in Yitzchak Yifat's upturned face, that skeptical secularism may not be an adequate way of understanding the Jewish story, that God may be real after all, end quote. And here, I think, is where Hezekiah speaks to us. For the first time since that biblical king, ladies and gentlemen, we live today in an age where millions of people around the world are entranced by the miracle of Jerusalem's endurance. In an age of a largely dominant secular or even pagan culture in the West, the endurance of Jerusalem is, for millions around the world, the greatest proof for the God of Abraham. I always knew this to be so, but I think it truly hit me when I was sitting one day eating breakfast in an Israeli hotel, a distracting activity, as it often is, and I'm reading about a large South American country which wants to move its embassy to Jerusalem. The explanation given by the leader was the following, quote, "It is only symbolic, but it is worth a lot to those who believe in God," end quote. And I sat there and I realized that Jerusalem itself, Jewish Jerusalem, serves as a proof for the biblical God for millions of non-Jews around the world. And what this means is that today, for the first time since Hezekiah, Israel and the Jewish people may yet be poised to launch an empire of monotheism, an empire of ideas, an empire of biblical Hebraism. In a recent article in Mosaic, Eric Cohn wrote that for all biblical believers, Jew and Gentile, quote, "The improbable Jewish story, the resurrection of Jerusalem, provides perhaps the most compelling grounds for believing that good in the end will indeed ultimately triumph over evil. The Jews are the divine message in the bottle. Jerusalem, forever the Jews' city of hope, and once again the West's city of hope, is now," Cohn writes, "the emblem of our shared purpose to work with faith, political will, and moral resolve to rescue and defend our shared heritage from destruction and decay. We may well live in an age akin to Hezekiah, when many yearn to know of the God of Jerusalem. But God awaits, then as now, for us to act." Yossi Klein Halevi concludes his essay on the photo by reflecting that he often forgets the miraculous nature of the city Jerusalem in which he lives. But then he writes, "I suddenly remember where I am. I recall my father's wonder at the wall, whose improbable endurance he saw as a metaphor for the Jewish people. I ask myself what it is about this strange little people that continually finds itself at the center of international attention, repeatedly on the front lines against forces of evil, Nazism, Soviet communism, and now jihadism, all of which mark the Jews as their primary obstacle to achieving world domination. At those moments," he reflects, "I feel gratitude for having found my place in this story." Rubinger's photograph moves us because Jewish Jerusalem, and the Temple Mount above all, reflects the wondrous story of the Jews and the mysterious hand of God in history. This is our story, and it is now a story that millions around the world yearn to hear. Thank you very much.